Hello, in this video we're going to learn about file input and output, or file I/O in Python. So the reason we want to learn about this is because you may have noticed that so far when our programs finish running, all of the data, all the variables and the values the variables had when the program was running, those go away. Those weren't stored permanently. So that was stored in what's called volatile storage, so in our computer's RAM. But in a lot of situations, you want to have persistent storage. So storage of information that your program generated or received from the user that remains after the program finishes running, so that if you run the program again later, you can still access that data. So the most basic way to deal with this is to store or read data from like a plain text file. And you can do fancier things too, but that's kind of beyond the scope of what I want to work with in this class. So let's get started at looking at how you can do this in Python. And I'm going to show you a couple ways to open files. The first way I'm just going to show you for the sake of showing you, but it's not kind of the preferred way to do things. And then after this, just because you'll see this in some places is why I want to show it to you. But after this, I'll show you kind of the more correct way to do it. So the simple way to open files is just create a variable name. I'll just say F, that's pretty common for files. And then assign that to the result from this open function that's built into Python. And then in here, what we have to put in are the location of the file. So I've got a file called example.txt that I made, and usually pretty much all we're going to work with is .txt files. So these are plain text files. That's not like a Word document that has fancy formatting and stuff. It's just plain raw text. So that's the location of this file, and I'll come back to that, what I mean by location, in a second. And then I also need to tell it what I want to do with it. So the second parameter, or second argument you put in here into this open function call is what you want to do with it. So it's the mode that you're accessing the file with. For now, I'm going to put an R. That's short for read. So I want to read from the file. I don't want to write to the file. That's different. And then the last thing, this is optional, but I strongly encourage you to always do this just for correct code is to limit the amount of errors that you might encounter because of weird system settings and things. So encoding and then equals UTF-8. So pretty much if you get more advanced and learn about different encoding formats, you can change that. But for our purposes, this is just always going to be here at the end, just so we can make sure that everything's compatible. When I upload a file, a sample file for you to use or something, you'll be guaranteed to be using the right file encoding. Okay, so don't worry too much about that. That's just always going to be there whenever you call the open function at the end. All right, so let's get back to, so this is it. This will open a file. And so what this represents, the variable f does not represent the contents of the file. So I'll show you what's in the example.txt file. Here it is. It's got these lines of text. So f doesn't represent that data. What it represents is the file object. So just like an analogy I've heard before is like you have a DVD. The DVD is not the same. That's just what's containing the data, but it's not the same as the data. So the file object is like the DVD. We can do things with it. We can read from it. We can write to it. We can maybe add data to it. But the data is distinct from the file object. So we're going to use this to read and write data. All right, so that's what we've got so far. And I'm just going to go ahead and show you what this looks like, that I can get the data from this. And then we're going to come back and talk about what I mean by the location of the file. So I'm going to say the lines in the file are equal to f.readLines. And then I'm going to say for line in lines, print line. So you'll see. And then at the end here, this is why this isn't kind of the preferred way to open and close, or open and deal with files. I have to say close the file if I want to be careful and do everything properly. So I'm going to run this, and we'll see that what comes out down here, minus some weirdness with extra new lines, is what was written in this text file. So it loaded, you see that like apple, orange, that's not anywhere in the code here, but that's stored in this file on my computer. Okay, and I opened that up, and then I read all the lines from it, and now I'm printing them out. So, as far as this example.txt file though, I told it example.txt, but why it knows that that's the right thing to do is, let's see, my Python files. So why it knows that that's the right thing to do is because here's example.txt, and the Python file I'm working with is file.io. So those are in the same folder. So that's how it knows to open that text file, is because it's what's called a relative file path. But I could also use what's called an absolute file path. And I'm just going to, I already have it. Oh, that's not it. So I'm just going to copy that file path. So here's the absolute file path. It starts out with the hard disk drive. That's the persistent storage drive, physical media in my computer. And then it addresses folders and subfolders until at the end here I would get to the file I want. So example.txt. This is where it happens to be on my computer. It will be somewhere different on your computer. Okay, so usually we're just, to keep things simple, the easiest way obviously is to not even worry about all this and to just have this file in the same folder as your Python file. But with more complicated programs, there's reasons you might not want to do that. So here's an absolute file path, and there's one other kind of weird thing here. So if I run this, it's going to actually give me an error right now, and we'll see why. It says some kind of cryptic thing here, and that's resulting from these backslashes. These are called escape characters in Python, and pretty much all programming language, the backslashes is the escape character. And so it's trying to interpret the /u and the /d and so on as characters in some sense, which is kind of weird. So there's ways to deal with this. The first way is to escape the escape character by making all of these double backslashes. And that acts as one backslash. So if I run this again, it'll work now. And there's an easier way to deal with this. And we're going to talk more about escape characters in a minute in this video, because those are going to help us understand why there's extra lines here. So if I put this R before the starting quote, this means it's a raw string, so it kind of ignores these escape characters, and you have to write them in a different way if you want to. But this is the easier way. If you have the absolute file path, put it here and put the R for raw string in front. And if I run it now, it won't give me that weird error. And without this R, it's going to give me that kind of cryptic error again. Okay, but that's just kind of by the by. For the most part, if you want, you can always just keep your text file in the same folder as your Python file, and then you can run it and life is easy, okay? Alright, so that's what I mean by specifying the location of the file as the first argument here, and then the mode. We're in read mode here, and the encoding, which you'll always just have like that. Alright, so now let's look at, I said that this isn't kind of the preferred way to work with files, because weird things can happen, and if you have an error when you're working with a file, sometimes it doesn't get closed properly, and that ties up resources in your computer or causes permissions errors if you try and edit the file later. So I'm going to show you the preferred. This is the preferred and the way that you should pretty much always, if you're writing your own code, work with files. So what you do, instead of saying f equals, you say with, and then this part's the same. The open function works the same. You say with open as, and then the name of a variable again, and then a colon. So this is going to be like a with block, and it takes care of things for you, so we no longer have to say like f.close anywhere. It's going to take care of all that stuff for us. But if we want to work with f, it's got to be inside this block. It's got to be indented. So after it's not indented anymore, f is gone. Okay? Because the file will be closed out. So what this looks like is just like this, and now if I run it, does the same thing. So this is the basic structure for working with files. That's kind of the preferred method of doing so. So you say with open, and then whatever you're going to pass in here. So the only two things will change. The first two, you might have a different file name, or you might have a different mode, and we'll get to that in a second. So right now it's still in read mode. and then as f, and this is the name of a variable. So just like always, you could name that anything you want, but it's convention just to say f because that's nice and short and easy. Okay, so that's what we've got so far, and this is what opening and for reading or writing files will look like for the most part. You'll have this with block here. And as always, there can be multiple lines in here, and we'll get to that in a second. So let's look at different, like what's happening with this read lines thing. So I'm going to actually print out lines instead of printing each element, and we're going to look at what that is. So here's what we've got down here in the Python shell. I said lines is f, that's the file, .read lines, and then I'm printing lines. And this thing is a list. So it's a list of every line in the file. And those are, of course, each line is, of course, a string. So what it's got, each line, if we go back to this file, is when I'm typing lines in this file, what I actually typed was like apple, and then I pressed enter. So when I press enter, I'm doing something called creating a new line in the file. And that's actually stored as a character. It's an invisible character. We see it as going on to the next line, but the computer has to keep track of how does it know that the line ends here and starts here. Well, there's a character here called the new line character that represents that when this text is displayed, it should be on the following line, not on the same line. And when we read this line, that's read in by Python as well, those new line characters. And you'll notice the last thing in the last, strawberry, does not have that new, if we look in the shell, what we printed out here, it does not have that new line at the end because we didn't hit enter. But if I did hit enter on my keyboard and save this and run it again, I will get that new line. But usually if you have a well formatted file, the last line won't have the new line character. So but you could format it however you want. But that's what's going on here, and that's why when I printed out all the lines, they were separated by 2 spaces. So there's a few ways to read the contents of a file. This method works. It's not my preferred way of doing it. My favorite way of doing it is saying f.read. And now when I print lines, let's look at what this looks like. So what this looks like, what it is actually one long string. So it looks all right now, but really this is all one string. Now it's not like a list like this, so it's not quite as easy to work with. So what we can do is use a string function, or a string method rather, and I'm going to say lines equals lines dot split, not splot, split, and I'm going to split every time there's a new line character. I want to split it, and this is going to give me a list back. So let's just look at what this does. So what this does is it gives me that same list as before, but it split it based on when there was a new line character, and so those aren't in the list. And so that's a little bit usually kind of better to work with, because if I say for line in lines, I'll get, you see how there's not extra spaces? Like if we go way back, all these had like that extra space between the lines, which there's other ways to deal with, but I think this is a nice way to work with that, is to read the content of the file as one giant string and then split it using the new line character, based on the new line character. That's where we split it, and then we end up with a list of the lines of the file, and we don't have those extra new line characters floating around to deal with. Okay, and you can also read the file one line at a time. You can look into doing that on your own if you want. I don't think that's too useful usually, but you can definitely do that in certain situations. Okay, so, and so when we're working with these, if you do it like this, if you say like f.read, you're returning the entire contents of the whole file is just one giant string. So that's like the giant string in this case. In the case of the example, it's like apple, new line, orange, new line, and then all the way to the end here, kiwi, new line, and then it keeps going, and it's just one big string like that. That's what we're getting back in lines. And so when we print it, these new lines actually turn into hitting enter, or like actually going on to a new line, but this is what's actually stored in this variable if we do it like this. So it's pretty useful to know and be aware of a lot of the string methods available to you. So as always in the Python documentation, you can take a look at the string methods available. And they do, most of these are really easy to understand, and they're just really useful for doing simple things. So for instance, dot lower. So how these work, if I had, I'm just going to work in the shell so I can show you quickly. If I had a string like a equals apple, apple, and then I said a dot lower, that's going to return the same string but all lowercase. This is just an example of how string method works. But mind you, that doesn't actually change the value of a, because it just returned that value. So if I wanted to change it, I'd have to say a equals a dot lower, and then that will be the new value in the variable a. Okay, and then there's dot upper, which does similar. It just converts everything to all uppercase though. And those are some simple ones to understand, but there's lots and lots of things you can do with strings. So a really useful one is the strip. So that removes if there's extra spaces or new line characters at the beginning or end. So like this example here in the documentation, there's spaces at the beginning and spaces at the end, and you say dot strip on that string, it'll give you the string without the spaces at the beginning or end. One that we used was the split here. So it returns a list of the words in the string using the separator as the delimiter. So you can actually change, by default it uses the new, no, it doesn't. So by default it uses the space character, but what we did was say we want to separate it based on the new line character. Okay, so you can definitely look through here, and some of these will be useful for different situations that come up when you're trying to work with strings. Okay. And we might come back to this, but for now, I'll just leave that for you to check out if you want. So, what we haven't talked about yet is writing to a file. So I'm going to show you how to do that now. So there's two types of writing to a file. You could say, oh, and by the way, if I'm trying to read from a file and I give it a file that doesn't exist, I'll get an error down here. It says no such file exists. Just kind of by the way, we'll get an error if the file has to actually exist to be able to open it for reading. But if I put a W here instead, and I say a file that doesn't exist, so I'll just show you this doesn't exist. I'll get the error when I try to do this. If I change this to W, if the file doesn't exist, it'll create it for me, okay? And instead of, so this is going to open a file, and since we're in write mode, it's going to create that file. It's not going to give me an error because we're writing a new file anyway. And what I can do is say f.write, and then I put in a string here that I want to write. So I'll just say hello, and then I could put new line characters in here. So like hello, how are you? And then bye. Okay. And I'll get rid of this stuff. So this is going to write a file. It's going to create example2 does not exist. You can see there's no example2 here in my Python files folder. And it's going to create that file and it's going to write this data to it. So if I run this, ran, it doesn't output anything, so it just runs. And then I have on my computer now an example2 file, and look what it has. It has hello, and then a new line, how are you, and then a new line, and then bye. Okay, so that's how writing to files works. But there's a quirk. So we're in write mode. So what if I just ran this again, and I said, I don't know, how are you? Just something else. And I run this. You might expect naively that it would put that at the end, but let's run it in. So I'll close this out so we don't get anything confusing. Oh, whoops. So I'll just run this and we'll see what happens. So it ran, finished running. So if I go back to example2, that stuff from before isn't there, so it overwrote the file. So if you write the file and you have W here, it's going to write everything from scratch. So there is a way to add stuff to the end. There's append mode. So we've seen R for read, W for write, and we use A for append. So now I can close this out, and I'll write to it again, and I'll run it. And if I open this again, it's not just going to have the one line, it's going to have that twice. And if I want it to have it on a new line, I'd have to say /n or \n, reload the file. Here we go. Okay, so this is appending data to the end of the file now. And yeah, if you want it to be on a new line, you have to explicitly say new line characters. So I kind of didn't intend for this. That's a little mistake that you'd find in your programs. All right, so that's it. Really, you know everything you need to know about how to work with files now. But I'm going to show you a couple example things, interesting things to do when you're working with files, all right? So let's see. I have a words.txt file that has, some of these are kind of weird, but it has words from the English language, and it has 235,000 of them in here, okay? So that's kind of interesting. You could think of all kinds of uses for this, like you're making a Scrabble game, you want to check if the word's real or not, because you wouldn't want to put all of this inside your Python file, right? You'd have 230,000 lines of code before you ever got to the actual code that does something. So this is another reason that you want kind of external storage for your file, is if you have a lot of data. So what I'm going to show you how to do, and this was what I'm going to show you how to do is pick a random word out of this. Might be interesting for some things. So I'm going to import random, and that file was called words.txt, words.txt, and I'm going to open it in read mode, encoding as usual. And what I want to do here is read. So I'll just say, you can name, I'll name this data, or you can name it, data's fine. You can name it whatever you want, but what we're going to do is say data equals f.read. And then we could stay inside the open block, but we don't have to. I will, I guess. I'll say word, that's going to be like the random word, or how about words equals, and we're going to split it up, so it's going to be data.split, and then based on the new line character, because again, we want to split up, we want a list of all the words in this file, but split based on the new line character, okay? And then words will be a list of 235,000 entries that are just a bunch of words, right? And then what I can do is just say random, if I have a list, random.choice will give me, so I can show you down here in the shell how that works. Import random, and then random.choice, and if I put in a list, like whatever it might be, it's going to randomly choose one of those elements and return it. So in this case, it chose the 3 randomly. So we're going to do random.choice, but with a much bigger list, right? We're going to do random.choice with words. And that's going to be our random word. And if I print word, it should, from that text file, it should have randomly picked one of the words. And if I run it, it'll print that word. And if I run it again, it'll print a different word. And keep going, okay? So that's just an example of how to use a text file that has a lot of data in it to do something interesting. And when you could think of an example of how to use this might be if you're writing a Hangman program. Maybe you don't want some of these weird words in there, but you'd want a big list of words, and so that you could randomly decide a word to start out the game with, for instance. Lots of other, like if you're generating random passwords, you wouldn't really want to use the random generator in Python for that, but same idea. You'd, so you'd use that file to load in all that data and then make a choice from that data in this case. All All right, and last, I just want to quickly show you. Um, I was going to kind of create this whole program, but I think that the video is kind of running a little long, so I'm just going to show you the program, and you'll get an idea of how it works. So this is a little program that I kind of modified for my own use off of a tutorial website I found, and I thought it might be useful for our purposes here. So what it does, I'll just run it, and we'll kind of just spend just a couple minutes going through how it works, kind of at a high level, and I'll post the code for this if you want to take a look at it for yourself. So what this does, it's like a phone number kind of address book or something. So it's got some options here. This is the menu here, so I'm going to type 1. I want to print the phone number. So right now there's 2 phone numbers stored in a text file on my computer, and I can show you numbers.txt. It's got these 2 numbers stored in it, separated by the name of the person and then a comma. And I can do stuff like add a phone number. It'll say name, Sally, number, and I could put like a fancy formatted number here too if I wanted, but just an example. And then if I print the phone numbers again, it'll have that now in the file. And if I reload the file, it'll be in here too. Okay, so, and then I can look up a number. So if I hit 3 and I look up Sally's number, it'll tell me the number is blah, blah, blah. And I can quit. So let's just quickly look at how this program works, because it involves reading and writing from files, and so it's kind of a neat little example. So we start out, we define some functions. We'll get back to those. That's where the meat of the program occurs. But I say, here's the name of the file I'm working with, in my case, numbers.txt, and then while true, print out the menu, get the choice from the user, what they want to do. If the choice is 1, print all the numbers in this file, numbers.txt. If the choice is 2, add a name to the file. So add a name to this file, and here's the name and number we want to add to the file. If the menu choice is 3, look up a number, look up in this file, look for that name that they gave. If the choice is 4, exit the program, otherwise invalid choice. Okay, so let's look at the print numbers, for instance. So, and the menu is just a bunch of, the print menu function is just a bunch of print statements that's for the menu. So, yeah, we're going to look at the print numbers file name. So we read in the file name, and we print out telephone numbers, and then open that file in read mode as F, and then you can actually do this all in one line. I was doing it in multiple lines before, but there's no reason you can't say .read .split every time there's a new line. And each line in that file, remember, was a name, a comma, and then a number. So I'm checking if there's a comma in the line. So we're making sure it's not the last line of the file, which doesn't have anything, because there's a new line character at the end. If there's a comma in that line, so this is name and number in each, and data is the list of all the lines in the file. If there's a comma in the current line we're looking at, say the name from the file and the number from the file is that line split by the comma character. So the name is going to be, in the first case, is going to be Adam, and the number is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, and then we can print out. And so this notation where you have multiple variables separated by commas, remember this thing actually returns a list, but if I put multiple variable names on the left, as long as there's the same number of variables over here as there are items in the list that this returns, it'll split up the list for you automatically, so it's a little easier to read. I could just make this one variable and have this be like index 0 in the list and this be index 1, but this is a little easier to read. So I print out the name from the file and the number from the file, and I keep doing that for each line in the file, as long as it's not the last line, which is what this if statement checks for. Okay, so that's how that works. The add number, so that's what I do if the menu choice is 2, add a number to the file. That's the simplest one, because I just open the file in append mode, and I add the name they gave, plus a comma, plus the number they gave, plus a new line character. Okay, and let's see, We have lookup numbers. So this is the last function that we haven't seen. So that's for menu choice 3, and this is the most complicated one for sure. So I have a file name and a name I want to look up the number for. Open up the file as usual, read all the data in the file as one giant string, and then split it up based off the new line character. And then I'm going to use a dictionary for, I'm going to say numbers is a empty dictionary. So this is a dictionary with just nothing in it. And then I'm going to do the same loop for each name and number in data. If there's a comma in the line, so this is the same exact stuff that we saw up here, pretty much word for word so far. So if there's a comma in the line, name from the file and number from the file are the result of splitting that line up where the comma is. And then I'm going to add to the dictionary. The name is the key in the dictionary, and the number is going to be the value. So the key value pair here is the name from that line is the key, and the number is the value. And that's adding a new entry to the dictionary, right? And so then I say, after this loop is done, I've filled the dictionary out. So it has 3 entries, 3 key value pairs in this case, but it could have more if you had more numbers in your file. And then I say if the name is in that dictionary, if it's one of the keys in the dictionary, return that the number is the numbers with that key. And that's going to represent the number for that person's name. Otherwise, that wasn't found in that dictionary. Okay, so I'm going to print this out just because I think that might be a little bit confusing. I'm going to print out the numbers dictionary when I do this function, just so you can see. If I go to lookup number and I say Sally again, right here is the dictionary that I'm making. It's Adam is the key, the value is 1, 2, 3, 4. Larry is the key, the value is that. Sally is the key, the value is that. And that's what I was building up. I started out with an empty dictionary here, and I used the data in the file to build it with this line, basically. Alright, so sorry if I went a little long in this video, but it was kind of a lot to cover, and I wanted to make sure we did a good job, and I showed you some meaningful examples so you can see some of the stuff in action. Alright, thanks for your attention in this video. I'll catch you in the next one.